Hi, I want to talk about thesis, intro, conclusion. I'm going to do it quickly, and I'm going to look at the rubric and then the sample. I urge you to take this video in parts, and after each part, stop and do the task that I just talked about. So the first thing you want to do now that you have all your body paragraphs together is add a thesis. And the instructions for the thesis are right here in the rubric. It's really the same as paper number 1, except for the fact that instead of one author, Twain, sorry, it's not letting me select all that text. Instead of one author, Twain, you're looking at probably multiple authors, although some of you have decided to focus on one. Either way, it's the same thing, right? Your thesis is going to answer the guiding question. What do these authors I've chosen to write about have to say through these works about the tension I've chosen to write about? And there's some samples here that are worth looking at. They're good examples of thesis statements for multiple authors. Sorry, here we go. And they're good examples of what I like to call the umbrella thesis, where you sort of make a larger overarching comment that fits the writers into a spectrum. Now, notice how both thesis statements use both of the terms, even if you're going to emphasize one over the other in your analysis. Notice also that we're answering that guiding question. We're not just repeating the question, we're answering it. We're saying, what is the author saying about this? Now, for a good example of a list type thesis, let's look at the sample paper. And you can see here in the sample paper, see if I can scroll up a little bit, his thesis is basically 3 independent clauses that each discusses where the author he's going to look at is on the spectrum. So while those samples on the rubric are umbrella statements, broader spectrum type things, this list approach says this author does this author does this, and this author does that. And so you can see Faulkner mocks and criticizes, O'Connor argues for grace, Baldwin argues that neither works. It's really a nicely put together thesis because there is an interrelationship there, even though we get authors separate. The only problem with this thesis, by the way, is there should be semicolons. There should be a semicolon here, just one, because you got 2 independent clauses. But other than that missing semicolon, this is really a fine thesis. Not any better than the 2 on the rubric, though, just trying to show you different models. Okay, so with this in mind, why don't you stop this video and go ahead and work on drafting your thesis. So now that we have a thesis, the next step is to add an intro. And there we can see on the rubric, come on! All right, it's not going to let me select again. There we can see on the rubric again what we're supposed to do on our intro. It's really important, and many of you are not doing this in either your first paper or your drafts, to define each term separately and fully. So this term from the spectrum means this in the 20th century. This term from the spectrum means this in the 20th century. Here's how they push and pull at each other. And then you segue into the thesis. So it's both terms separately and fully, how they collide, pull, or push, or merge with each other, and then your thesis about what the writers say. We're not talking about the writer and the text, writers and text, till we get to the thesis. The intro is about framing and explaining the tension so your terms are defined as you go through the paper. Let's take a look at the sample essay and how it does that in the intro. I shared this intro with you earlier when you were working on your own schematic outlines, and you'll notice it's pretty lengthy. So obviously he's talking about religion, and he works through the different ideas about religious faith. So we've got, 4 sentences about religious faith. Then he moves into skepticism and what that is. And we get another 4 or 5 sentences about that. Then we get the collision, right? Where the 2 viewpoints come together, how this was a national tension, how this was something Americans were struggling with. And then finally you end with that thesis. So again, you can really see how this sample intro lays out what we want to do. take our time defining one term, in this case religious faith, take our time defining the other one, in this case skepticism or rationalism, right? And then talk about how they collide and how they are a tension that pull and push at each other in American culture, how they're a contested question, and then wrap up with your thesis. So go ahead and stop and go back and look at the thing you drafted for your schematic outline and see how it matches up with where we want to be here. If it matches, paste it in. If it needs some work, edit it, add to it, make it look strong and clear with both terms clearly defined. You'll see this actually really helps you as you do your final revisions of your paper as well. Okay, so pause the video, work on your intro, then we'll come back and talk about conclusion. Okay, so this conclusion is slightly different than our first one. In the first paper, I asked you to sort of think about what would Twain say about where we are today versus where we were in the period that he wrote. This conclusion is entirely about you. Where do you think we are compared to where the writers you discussed think we were? So this conclusion is your chance to think about, apply, and reflect on the meaning of the tension you've been discussing in your writers and look at it here in the 21st century and share your perspective on that. I'm not looking for a couple sentences. I'm looking for a big, fat, cool reflection, something that shows you're making the connection between the literature we're reading and the world we're living in today. It's a really important kind of concluding moment in the course for you. So I want you to invest yourself in it. Now, having said that, I want to point out that Brian has a very good conclusion. He starts off sharing a larger reflection, but he pretty quickly moves into a personal reflection. Is that okay? Absolutely. It's absolutely okay if you want to talk about this tension in your own life because you see a connection between the readings that you've done. Notice he talks about Sonny in his conclusion and how you see this problem in our contemporary world in terms of your own life. So this is a very personal take. You don't have to do this, though. You could take a more sociological take where you talk about where you just think America is and look at the larger American culture. So you can either take a very personal angle or you can take a broader cultural angle, but either way, it's your interpretation. It's either your interpretation of this tension in your own life as a 21st century American or your interpretation of what you think is happening in general in 21st century America with the tension that you've explored in your paper. I hope you have fun with the conclusion, but I also hope you use it as a chance to really do some meditation on what these ideas mean to you and mean to our world. All right, hope this video was helpful. See you in Canvas.